Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Emil, and I'm Assistant Director of Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you all for joining us and welcome. Thank you to our members in attendance today. Your support is critical to our work. If you're not yet a member, please do consider joining. We have a wide variety of levels for you to choose from. Tonight's event is part of our series, China's Changing Landscape, and we would like to thank Dover Corporation for their continued support and sponsorship of this series. We'd also like to thank the Council on Foreign Relations, with which we partner to develop this program. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs is an independent and nonpartisan platform. The views expressed by the individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Please silence your phones, but definitely not your voices. This event is on the record. We are live streaming, and we will be taking questions later on your browser at chi.cnf.io. Finally, before I turn it over to our speaker, a few brief words of introduction for her. Elizabeth Economy is the CV Starr Senior Fellow and Director for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She is an acclaimed scholar on Chinese domestic and foreign policy, and she has written on topics from China's environmental challenges to its resource quest. Her writing has appeared in both foreign policy and scholarly journals, including Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, New York Times, Harvard Business Review, among many others. Her new book is The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State, and it will be available for purchase and signing tonight from our partners, the bookseller. I'll return to moderate audience Q&A, but for now, please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Economy to the Council.
Thank you so much, Emil. It's great to be here, and thank you to the Chicago Council for hosting me this afternoon. My sister lives here. My son is a sophomore at the University of Chicago, and my daughter's about to start this fall, so I feel like Chicago's becoming a second home for me. So any excuse to come out here, I'm up for it. So there's really never a bad time to talk about China. China, always something going on inside China. Clearly, the US-China relationship has heated up over the past year or so, but I do think that this is an especially important time. And I'd like to start just by sharing an insight from my most recent trip there, which was about 5 or 6 weeks ago. I had gone as part of a delegation of research analysts and scholars to meet with Chinese counterparts to talk about the potential for cooperation. You know, what sort of areas could we find where we could work together? I think an important endeavor in a time when the bilateral relationship has become somewhat fraught. I would say the Chinese side was not particularly interested in looking for common ground at this moment, in large part because they were focused more on what was going on between the United States and China at the time. President Trump had just signed the Taiwan Travel Act, which sort of encourages meetings between senior US officials and Taiwanese officials. He was threatening the big tariffs on a whole range of Chinese goods, and he had announced that he was planning to meet with the president of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, which surprised the Chinese. So they were much more focused on these events than anything else. But I did hear something interesting, something I heard for the first time, and that was a Chinese official referring to China as a superpower. In the 20-odd years that I've been traveling back and forth to China, China has gone from being the world's largest developing country to a regional or an emerging power. Under Xi Jinping, Chinese officials started to talk about China as a major or a global power, but this was the first time I'd heard it referred to as a superpower. And I think this is important because it signals that the Chinese have begun to think about their country as having not only the capabilities, but also the intent to play alongside the United States, to begin to develop the rules of the road, to shape global norms and institutions. And I think it's also very reflective of Xi Jinping's ambition, his great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and his effort to have China reclaim a sort of more central role on the global stage. As I was doing the research for this book, going through Xi Jinping's speeches and looking at what he was actually putting in place in terms of policy initiatives over the past 5 years, I became convinced pretty quickly that he was a transformative leader on par with Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. Mao Zedong, of course, launched the first revolution, the creation of the Chinese party state in 1949, 1950. Then we had Deng Xiaoping with his period of reform and opening up and low-profile foreign policy, the introduction of the market into the Chinese economy, a welcoming of outside influences, both in terms of foreign capital, but also foreign ideas, the blossoming of civil society and development of non-governmental organizations. But by the same token, still, Deng Xiaoping wanted to maintain a low-profile foreign policy. He wanted to focus on what was happening inside the country. And he himself termed his period, his 30 years of reform and opening up, the Second Revolution. And for me, Xi Jinping has launched a third revolution. He really has, in many respects, upended Deng's Second Revolution. So instead of the collective leadership that Deng Xiaoping put in place to avoid the excesses of Mao period, Xi Jinping has consolidated power in his own hands, really an enormous amount of institutional power. Instead of the period of reform and opening up, we have Xi Jinping creating a kind of virtual wall of regulations and restrictions so that he can more closely control what comes in and what goes out of the country. Xi Jinping also has pushed the party to penetrate more deeply into Chinese society and into the Chinese economy. Again, this reverses much of what Deng Xiaoping did, because a hallmark of Deng's Second Revolution was the withdrawal of the party from many of the sort of daily activities of the Chinese people. And finally, Xi Jinping has certainly not pursued a low-profile foreign policy. He has a much more ambitious and expansive vision for China's role on the global stage. So what I'd like to do is just sort of sketch out how I see this new model of Chinese politics developing, and then talk a little bit at the end about how I think the United States ought to respond. So when I think about the China model under Xi Jinping, I often visualize it as a pyramid, with Xi Jinping sitting at the very top, on top of a sort of a communist party made up of 89 or 90 million members. The Communist Party sitting on top of the country, and the country sitting on top of the world. So I'm just going to sketch it out according to that pyramid. So Xi Jinping at the very top. As I indicated, Xi has amassed a very significant amount of institutional power in his own hands. It's been a very step-by-step, methodical approach that he's adopted to achieving this objective. He began, I would say, with his very first press conference when he said that corruption could be the death of the Chinese Communist Party and even the death of the Chinese state if it were not addressed. So he launched at the very outset of his tenure, 5.5 years ago, a major anti-corruption campaign. And he distinguished it from previous anti-corruption campaigns because anti-corruption campaigns have been a staple of Chinese life, dating back centuries. But typically they wax and they wane. Maybe they started after a year or two, they sort of slow down. But Xi Jinping, every year, more people have been arrested and prosecuted than the year before. In 2017, over 500,000 officials were arrested. And China has a 99% success rate in its prosecution. So once you're arrested, you're pretty much done for. But it's significant because while the anti-corruption campaign is real, and I should note that anti-corruption was actually something that Xi Jinping talked about all throughout his career. So as he was moving up throughout the party secretaries in various provinces, he always talked about the need for officials to be clean and not to be compelled by financial gain. But he used it both to clean out the party, because it did need to be cleaned out. The corruption is endemic, but also to target his political enemies. So there's a great study that was done by a professor up at Harvard that showed at the sort of more senior levels in the Chinese officialdom, about the vice ministerial level and above, that roughly 40 to 50% of the officials that were targeted were somehow tied into Xi Jinping's political opponents. So one thing he did was to use this anti-corruption campaign to eliminate his political opposition. Beyond that, he began to assume very quickly control of all of the most important committees and commissions that oversee the broad areas of Chinese policy. So that whether it's cyber policy or economic reform or national security, Xi Jinping put himself at the top of all of those committees and commissions. It was very unusual. Typically, for example, the premier, who's in charge of the economy, would sit on top of the Economic Reform Commission. But Xi Jinping took control of all of them. That also gave him a separate power base, because each of those committees has its own set of officials that report to the leader of the committee. Then we saw at the 19th Party Congress in October that Xi Jinping got his name and his thought put into the Chinese constitution in a way that only Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping had done previously. And he managed not to signal a successor. And that was the first time in 25 years that the party general secretary had not signaled a successor after his first 5-year term was over. And that started to give people the idea that he planned to stay on beyond 2 terms, beyond 10 years. And then, of course, what got a lot of attention was at the National People's Congress this past March when they amended the Chinese constitution to eliminate the 2-term the 2-term limit for the presidency. And then now what that means is that Xi Jinping can occupy all 3 of the most important positions, the party general secretary, the presidency, and the Central Military Commission in charge of the military for as long as he wants, or until the people push him out. But basically, as people say, he could be president for life. So we've seen just in the past 5 years that he really has managed to consolidate power in a way that I think has surprised many people, both inside China and outside China. The second aspect of his sort of transformative push politically has been the growing penetration of the Communist Party into the life of the Chinese people and into the Chinese economy. And we can see this in a number of ways. First, in terms of the surveillance system that the party has begun to implement. China now has about 176 million cameras. They want to move that up to about 626 million cameras so that they can have facial recognition. They're moving forward with voice recognition. If you look at Xinjiang, which people now call a police state, that's an autonomous region in the western part of the country. They have things like apps on everybody's phone so they can see if somebody is, trying to, research or look up something having to do with a certain religion. Anything forbidden, they can track it immediately to the public security. If they buy a knife, they're associated with the QR code, so they know exactly, who bought a knife. So the level of penetration of the party knowledge and their sort of efforts at control are growing very rapidly. So that's one element of Xi's sort of new system. You may also have heard of the social credit system, where it's a system of trying to understand the trustworthiness of the Chinese people. So using the system of e-payments, but also a wide array of data that are being collected. Could be by your neighbor, could be by what you buy, could be the number of video games that you buy or how many hours of video games you play. They're assessing your credit. And so people who have a low credit score may not get the best seat at a restaurant, or if you default on a loan, for example, and don't pay the loan back, you can't fly. So there are now 6 million people in China who can't get on a plane. So again, a way that the government is trying to micromanage in many respects the daily life, the political life, the social life of the Chinese people. It's also affecting the Chinese economy. Again, Deng Xiaoping withdrew the party from many aspects of the Chinese economy, but Xi Jinping is quite interested in having the party govern more closely economic activity. So if you look not only at the state-owned enterprises, but even joint ventures and private enterprises, you see that Xi is pushing for party committees within these enterprises. So party committees are made up of party members. And typically, a party committee might meet, once a week, or it might meet once a month. Basically, you would get information from the central government, would say, here's some new theory that you should all learn and study, or perhaps you should go do a tree planting campaign on this day, or whatever it was, these kind of directive. But now, Xi is pushing to have these party committees play a much more active role in the actual governance of these enterprises. So not simply the state-owned enterprises, but also if you talk to many businessmen who are involved in joint ventures in China now, you'll find that they're facing a lot of push from the party committees to get a seat on the board, or to have the party committee chairperson be the chair of the board. They want to have a say in investment decisions, persuading a company where to invest, for example. So if the government wants to develop a particular part of the country or particular city, to be able to tell the joint venture, we'd like you to establish your manufacturing plant here or there. So this is another sort of new innovation under Xi Jinping that's causing a lot of consternation. And again, not simply among multinationals and foreigners, but also among the Chinese themselves. Entrepreneurs, for example, are quite concerned, tech entrepreneurs, when Xi Jinping says, or the party says, that it wants to take a 2% stake in some of these behemoth tech companies. And by the way, then they'll take a seat on the board. And by the way, they'll control a certain part of the firm's business, right? Maybe some particularly politically sensitive part of the firm's business. So again, a way that Xi Jinping is pushing to have the Communist Party play a closer role, a tighter role in controlling what's going on in the Chinese economy. The third element of the sort of new Chinese model is that virtual wall of regulation and restriction that I mentioned. So to try to control more closely what's coming into the country. Xi Jinping is very concerned about the influence of Western ideas on Chinese officials, on Chinese young people. There was a big uptick in the first few years of Xi's tenure in sort of the media talking about hostile foreign forces. And so the West, or as they call hostile foreign forces, were blamed for everything, you know, from a labor protest to the stock market crash in 2015. All of this was being driven by hostile foreign forces that were trying to undermine the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party. So Xi has taken a number of steps, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. One is the law on the management of foreign NGOs, which came into force in January of 2017. So prior to that point, there were about 7,000 registered non-governmental organizations, foreign non-governmental organizations in China. And they were involved in things like environmental protection or poverty alleviation, public health. In the environment, for example, they were responsible for helping to fund about 90% of Chinese NGOs. So there was an enormous amount of partnership between these foreign NGOs and the domestic NGOs, doing training, capacity building, you know, legal rule of law, helping to develop institutions. But in any case, come January 2017, Xi Jinping moved the registration of these foreign non-governmental organizations from the Ministry of Civil Affairs to the Ministry of Public Security, which I think in and of itself signals the way that he understood these NGOs, right, that they posed a kind of public security threat. So today, there are about 300 foreign NGOs that are formally registered in China. So about 5% of the ones that previously existed. And the range of their activities is highly circumscribed and constrained, and everything they do has to be recorded, all of the programs that they want to pursue. They make it very difficult at this point for that kind of interaction. But it's a good way for Xi Jinping to constrain the growth of Chinese domestic civil society, given the important role that these foreign NGOs were playing in contributing to develop Chinese civil society before that. A second example might be the Made in China 2025, and many of you may have read about this. It's been a fair amount in the media. It's one of the things that President Trump has been critical of. It's a pretty significant form of industrial policy, basically where Xi Jinping has set out that between 2015 and 2025, he wants to ensure that Chinese companies control the domestic market in 10 critical areas of sort of cutting-edge technology. So this could be things like new materials or electric cars or artificial intelligence. And to ensure this, you know, there are things like market barriers. There's been a lot of push for Chinese companies to go out and acquire technology companies from the United States or Germany, elsewhere. At one point, for a period of about 6 months during the spring of 2016, Chinese firms were putting in to buy one German technology company every single week. So it was really quite extraordinary drive. Now, 2017 has witnessed a pretty significant drop-off in that kind of activity. But the idea, again, is that, you know, these companies, that Chinese companies will control about 80% of the domestic market in all of these areas. So it's another way that, you know, that Xi Jinping is trying to insulate the Chinese economy from foreign competition and protect it so that, you know, it has time to grow Chinese companies. And then last, I think, is the issue of the Chinese foreign policy. And, you know, again, a big part of Xi Jinping's Chinese dream and the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is reclaiming, right, that sort of historical sense of China, Chinese centrality on the global stage. And I think there are really three ways that I think about how China's pushing forward on this. You know, first is that Xi Jinping is moving from staking claims of Chinese sovereignty to realizing them. So if you look at Xi's efforts, for example, in the South China Sea, I mean, China has, for decades claimed a very expansive area, maritime domain, 80 to 90% of the South China Sea as Chinese. And there have been, some little, fishing boat run-ins, Coast Guard little problems. But Xi Jinping, in 2014, 2015, moved very aggressively, not only to reclaim land for 7 of these sort of small atolls and turn them into real islands, but he's militarized them. Even though he said he would not militarize them, he's militarized them. And I think just last week, he put missiles on 2 of them. So that's one big move. The second is Hong Kong, where I think China is gradually moving to erode Hong Kong autonomy. And it does this in very subtle ways. For example, pushing to have Chinese history books, mainland Chinese history books in the Hong Kong educational system, or penalizing people for making fun of the Chinese national anthem, threatening them with jail at soccer games. Most recently, they've built a train station that serves a high-speed rail link between Hong Kong and Guangzhou. Half of the train station is under mainland Chinese government control. And a lot of Hong Kong people protested this. But these are all sort of small incursions into Hong Kong autonomy, into Hong Kong sovereignty. But little by little, China can change the landscape in this way. And finally, Taiwan, and this is a source of pretty significant debate, I would say, in the China field, is just how assertive Xi Jinping is prepared to be in terms of trying to assert Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. He has set a soft deadline of 2049 for the reunification of China, which includes Taiwan, certainly. I think if you look at what she's been doing over the past 5 years, you see a mix of inducements and coercive measures. So on the inducement side, for example, promising Taiwanese businesses that if they locate on the mainland, they'll be treated as mainland enterprises would be treated. More coercive measures are, for example, refusing to meet with the sort of senior leadership of Taiwan. So none of the senior officials that typically conduct cross-strait negotiations have met since Tsai Ing-wen, the leader of the DPP, was elected just 2 years ago. And he's doing this to punish her for her sort of more independent stance. Or telling Chinese tourism companies to reduce the number of tourists going to Taiwan. It's a kind of economic coercion. It's a tool that China uses frequently, but for a small island like Taiwan, it can have a pretty significant impact. The second sort of major thrust of Chinese foreign policy under Xi Jinping is the Belt and Road Initiative. And this has gotten a lot of attention in the press. I'm sure many of you have read about it. Initially, it was proposed by Xi Jinping in 2013, 2014. It was a sort of a grand-scale infrastructure project to connect China to 68 other countries, through roads and pipelines, railroads, ports. But it has evolved significantly since then. So now it's open to the entire world, not only the 68 countries. There's also a digital Belt and Road. So China is pushing forward to try to capture the GPS systems and the e-commerce and fiber optic cables. They've proposed a polar ice belt and road. There's a security component to it. So they've built their first logistics base in Djibouti. And I think there will be more bases to come. China now controls 76 ports in 35 countries. And although they say that these are for commercial purposes, in a number of instances, we've seen that after they take control of the ports, that PLA Navy ships stop by for port visits. And there's a political element to this as well. So the surveillance system that I mentioned, they are looking to export, for example, to Pakistan. They are training officials in Namibia and Sudan and South Sudan and Cambodia and Laos and some Latin American countries on how to manage the population, how to develop propaganda. So there's a little bit of an element of exporting a China model. So the Belt and Road has, which started off as simply an infrastructure project, has really morphed into something of much greater significance. Now, whether or not it will achieve its grand objectives remains to be seen, and there's a lot of pushback from a number of the countries, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A if anybody would like to. But in vision, it really is it is grand scale and potentially transformative for the geopolitical, economic, and strategic landscape. And then finally, I think Xi Jinping, in 2014, he delivered a speech where he said that he wanted China to be able to contribute not only to help write the rules of the game, but also to construct the playgrounds on which the games are played. And so we've seen in the past few years that China has begun to play a much more active role in global governance, right? Not simply, with President Obama on climate change or stepping up to the plate on Ebola, but actually trying to shape norms and institutions. So, for example, bringing its own vision of cyber sovereignty, of internet sovereignty to negotiations on cyber issues, or trying to rewrite some of the language in the United Nations Human Rights Commission so that it reflects Chinese values as opposed to liberal Western values. So I think that's another significant, it sort of floats a lot under the radar, but it's actually quite significant and, over the long term, potentially quite transformative for global governance and for the way that nations interact. So in sum, if you were to try to just get this into 5 or 6 words about what it is that Xi Jinping is creating, I would say that he's creating a China that is both more insular, more controlling, more authoritarian at home, but more ambitious and more expansive abroad. So with all of that, what should the U.S. do? I think it's not clear that Xi's model is sustainable, but I think it's important to look at China as it is today and try to think, what should we be doing differently? Does Xi Jinping present a new type of challenge, a new type of opportunity for the United States? And I think he does both. I think in terms of a new opportunity, I actually think his ambition presents a new opportunity for the United States. So he's ambitious to lead. That means that we can call upon him, as President Obama did on climate change, as we did on Ebola, but also on things like refugees, for example. There's a refugee crisis in his own backyard in Myanmar and Bangladesh. 750,000 Rohingya have fled to Bangladesh. That's an area where China could step up to the plate and do more. North Korea is an area where we have worked with China with a certain amount of pressure, certainly. But that's another place where, I guess, Xi Jinping's ambition to be seen as cooperative, to be seen as a constructive player on the global stage, I think works to the U.S. advantage. And when Xi Jinping stands on the stage at Davos and says that he wants China to be a defender of globalization, I think it's eminently reasonable for the rest of the world to say, that's great. Globalization means the free flow of capital, perhaps the free flow of information. China, you do neither, so let's see some reform in that direction. So I think, we can now hold Xi Jinping to account for the type of leadership that he wants to exert. Beyond that, I think we need to be working with our allies, and I think this is an area where the current administration falls short. I think President Trump has adopted a much bilateral approach to working with China. But our greatest strength in many respects rests with working with our allies with whom we share values and approaches and policy priorities. So whether you're looking at security in the South China Sea, or you're looking at China on intellectual property theft, these are all areas where a substantial portion of the rest of the world basically agrees with the U.S. stance, right? We want freedom of navigation in the South China Sea and beyond. We want China to stop IP theft. We can work together to bring pressure to bear on China. But that requires efforts on the part of the U.S. to coordinate and to bring that pressure to bear. I also think that it's necessary at this point to develop a certain amount of reciprocity and pushback. So I think here's an area where President Trump, to some extent, has it right. I think the Chinese have gotten very used to the United States that, encourages China to do the right thing, that has believed to a large extent that if the United States models best practices, China will eventually come along. But at this point, for example, if you look at the area of trade and investment, I think it's fair to say, China is the second largest economy and has it's the world's largest trading power, has a profound impact on the global economy. We can't simply say it's okay for you to take another 10 years to develop your domestic institutions to protect intellectual property. So I think this is an area where it's time, and I think President Trump has done this, at least in the first stage, reasonably well, to step up to the plate and say, enough is enough. And that may mean adopting some reciprocity, where China keeps its areas of investment closed to the United States may want to close off certain areas of investment to China as well. It's tricky because, of course, the potential for that is very much that you're going to end up in a lose-lose proposition. Nonetheless, I think at a certain point in time, again, I think China's just too large to allow it to play in by its own rules. And then finally, I think for the United States, when we look at China's sort of grand vision and at its approach to the world, efforts like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the Belt and Road Initiative, there's a lot that's positive in these initiatives. And we should not step up and criticize China for its predatory economic games when we have nothing to bring to the table. So I think it's incumbent on us, number one, to ensure that we are strong at home, and whether that's our values or our economic strength, but also that we're projecting those values abroad, and that if we're going to try to compete with China, that we actually step up to the plate and offer an alternative. We can't simply criticize what they're doing. We have to be able to provide countries with an option to follow us. So I think President Xi offers both important challenges, but also some opportunities. So I'm going to stop there, and I will welcome your questions or comments on things that I've spoken about or other things that you might just be interested in.
Great, thank you so much. So we'll take some questions now. If you have a question, please raise your hand and please wait for the microphone to get to you. You can also submit questions online at chi.cnf.io. So we'll start with the front row here. Just a second, the mic's coming.
Thank you. That was a very, very nice and succinct summary. One of the prevailing hypotheses between the U.S. historical view of China is that as the middle class grows, that there will be increased liberalization. Xi does not seem to believe that, or is certainly acting to counter that. What's your view on where that clash is going to come? Is there going to be a clash? I mean, it seems to me that is the critical bet that he's making.
Right. So you may be aware that there was an article written recently that talked about how the United States got China wrong. And the idea being that, in fact, we had assumed, just as you suggested, that as the middle class developed, it would begin to follow the same sort of values and ideals and practices that other countries had as they grew wealthier and basically transition into a more open society. And now people are saying, we got it all wrong. I think Xi Jinping is one Chinese leader. And if you had a different constellation of Chinese leaders, I think you would have a different China emerging. If you look back to 2011 and 2012, before Xi Jinping came to power, right before in the fall of 2012, you would have seen an internet that was incredibly vibrant. The internet was really the source of the Chinese environmental movement. You had people taking polls saying, oh, we must have clean air. The Chinese government saying, we can't do that now. It took 30 years for us to get to this place. It's going to take another 30 years for us to address it. And Chinese people saying, no, we want clean air now. You had, and they won because of that. You had people talking about the need for political reform on the internet. You had, if there were a flood in Beijing, you had communities connecting, reaching out to help each other. You had the development, well, you have that even now, even more so, the development of feminist movement in China. So I think that middle class exists. You have the entrepreneurs, many of whom were leaders on the internet, in fact, calling for political reform, calling for environmental action. Some of the people who had 50 million followers on China's Sina Weibo on the internet were these billionaire entrepreneurs, again, calling for political change or reform at the very least. So I think that middle class is there. I think Xi Jinping, has taken a hard left for the time being. But I think you can see even now that whether it's LGBT rights or environmental activists or feminists, that there are enormous social pressures, or retired PLA officials, or People's Liberation Army officials who aren't getting their pensions. People in China will protest and they will stand up for their rights. So I don't think that China in some way is different from every other place. There's no unique Chinese society that doesn't embrace the opportunity to have its voice heard and to try to influence the decisions that affect it. But I do think for the time being, Xi Jinping has put in place a highly coercive and controlling set of political institutions that are going to at least keep those things on a low simmer for the time being. I think he's buying time, but I think he would like to see it continue. I don't think he's looking upon this. There was an argument when he first took power, of course, that he was going to be a great reformer. His father was a reformer, was political reformer, and she's going to be that way too, that this period of control is simply a moment in time, and then all of a sudden he's going to open up. I see absolutely no evidence of that, and there was no evidence of that as he was coming up the party ranks.
Okay, next question we'll take from this side here in the middle.
Well, Chinese system is not inherently Chinese. It was originally created in the Soviet Union and adopted in China. By now, it still exists in Vietnam, in North Korea, in Cuba. So in Soviet Union, they obviously tried at least twice very seriously to create collective or changeable leadership, and they failed. China tried it under Deng Xiaoping, and it seems they're turning back to unchangeable and single leadership. Do you think this kind of the Soviet-Chinese model just inherently by design contained this inevitability of unchangeable and single leader, or is it just accidental for China?
No, I don't think it's accidental. I think it's, again, I think it's driven by Xi Jinping. I mean, in the Soviet Union, you had Gorbachev, you had Yeltsin, then you had, who else? Putin. Had it not been Putin, had you had Medvedev, do you think you might have had a different outcome? I think maybe you might have. Look, the institutions are actually there in an interesting way in China for sort of political reform to occur. If you look back into the 1980s, late 1980s, China began to have village elections that were open and democratic, and you could elect non-communist party members, and sort of local urban districts could do the same. And the idea was that they would gradually move up the sort of, throughout up the political system. And that didn't happen, in part because of Tiananmen, I think. But the potential for that still exists. You also have a Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference that is a sort of shadow legislature. You have as many as 20 additional parties in China that have no real power, but they exist and they have members, and so there is an institutional infrastructure that if you wanted to give it democratic life, you could do that. That's not the direction in which Xi Jinping is moving. But I don't think it's necessarily the case that might not be a direction that another Chinese leader might move. So I think you could have the slow growth of democracy in China without a kind of revolutionary change.
We have a related question from our online audience. Are there any, kind of checks on Xi's power? Are there any institutions, any groups that can or might act as checks on his power?
Certainly, there are checks on his power, and one of the things that it's easy to miss in China because the system is opaque, and we can't really see the debates that go on inside the standing committee of the Politburo or the Politburo itself, and And we don't really have a good sense necessarily for how many protests take place in China. You know, the last count we had was back in, I want to say, 2010, and it was about 180,000 protests that year. But certainly there are checks in the sense that, you know, there are still 6 other members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo. And Xi Jinping has to some extent, bring about consensus there. You know, there have been a number of, not even just rumors, there have been statements by officials that there have been coup attempts against Xi Jinping since he's come to power. It's clear that there are some fairly significant pockets of discontent. When I was in China that last time that I mentioned 5 or 6 weeks ago, you know, some of the liberal intellectuals with whom I was talking were very unhappy with the elimination of the 2-term, you know, presidency. And it's not just them. I heard many of the older retired Chinese leaders were very unhappy with that because it had represented in their minds real progress. Deng Xiaoping initiated that back in 1982. It represented an institutionalized transfer of power that spoke, you know, very much against what Mao Zedong had done. So there are a lot of groups, I would say, that are out there that Xi Jinping knows he still has to be responsive to. So even if the pressures, we can't see all those pressures, they are still there.
Okay. Let's go to the lady in the yellow jacket here in the middle.
You talked about the UN and the understanding of human rights in an attempt by China to bring in Chinese values as well as Western. What are some of those values?
So what China wants is for the rest of the world to recognize 2 things. One, that things like economic development and economic human rights are equal to political rights. It doesn't want to have enshrined individual rights. So in its most recent bid, which was just about a month ago, it put in language that's seemingly quite innocuous, where it said that human rights should be for the mutual benefit of all countries. Right? That sounds fine, right? But what does that actually translate into? It translates into maybe agreement about what constitutes human rights, because China doesn't want to be criticized for its human rights. Right? It doesn't want the United Nations Human Rights Commission to be a forum in which China can be criticized, which it has been in the past. It doesn't want to be criticized for the fact that, you know, Liu Xiaobo's, the, you know, Nobel Prize winners, that his wife is under house arrest and nobody can reach her and she's very sick and, you know, is in terrible straits. It doesn't want to have that kind of criticism. So it's slowly but surely trying to just change the language in a way that will give its definition, its understanding of human rights, which is very much basically sovereignty, right? So that what happens within China is China's business as well. Equal standing. So I think those are the kinds of moves, and again, they can happen so subtly and so slowly that you don't even realize they're happening. So in that case, the United States was the only country that voted against that initiative. I think 17 countries abstained, but the US was the only one that voted against.
Okay, and we'll go to this side here, the lady in the blue shirt, please.
Thank you. How do you feel about President Trump's direction this morning to his own Commerce Department to lift the sanctions against ZTE?
You know, so, right, this is the Chinese company, ZTE, that was basically forbidden from doing business in the United States because it had done business with Iran and North Korea. And after it was initially sanctioned, it didn't take the actions that it was supposed to take in order to not be sanctioned, right? It was supposed to fire several people, and it turns out maybe they got bonuses instead. Anyway, so President Trump today said, yes, he spoke with Xi Jinping, and there are so many Chinese jobs at stake. You know, having just listened recently to a discussion by people in charge in Iowa of soybeans and pork talk about the jobs that are at stake in the agricultural sector from President Trump's, you know, sort of the threat of the tariff war, but President Trump's failure to acknowledge that they're suffering, I find it very odd. that President Trump would take Chinese jobs as a significant reason for him to reverse this decision. Beyond that, I think it's strange that he would take this step before Liu He, who is one of basically China's top economic negotiator at this point, is scheduled to come to the United States this week to begin the trade negotiations. And it's odd also, finally, because I heard that what we were going to get in return was China lifting the tariffs on agricultural products. So in essence, what we did was bring ourselves back to ground zero with this, near as I can tell. So I'm not clear how this sort of played out exactly, or why it played out the way it did. Maybe there is a grander scale bargain that's being struck behind the scenes. I think that's what we have to hope for, because on the face of it, it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
We have another news-related question from our online audience. How important was the role of China and Xi in getting the U.S. and North Korea on negotiating ground?
I mean, I think China was essential to the extent that it agreed to heightened sanctions over the course of the past year. I mean, that was something that President Obama tried without much success, and President Trump achieved. I mean, I think there is no doubt that he exerted a lot of pressure on the Chinese to ramp up the sanctions in the UN Security Council, and China agreed, and we levied secondary sanctions on Chinese companies when we found that they were violating the terms. And I think China stepped up to the plate in that regard. Now, how important was China in that last moment that made the decision between President Trump and President Kim to meet? It's not clear that China played a very significant role. As I mentioned, when I was in China, the Chinese were shocked that President Trump and President Kim were planning to meet. And one of them said, if you don't hold the meeting in Beijing, nothing good is going to come of this. Nothing's going to be accomplished, right? The sense there was that they were very concerned about being marginalized, that somehow they were worried that President Trump and President Kim were going to strike a deal that didn't, in some way, include Chinese interests. And in fact, the initial gambit by Kim Jong-un, which said that they would freeze their testing without asking for the United States and South Korea to freeze their military exercises, ran directly contrary to what China had been pushing, because China had, China's view was a freeze for freeze, that North Korea would freeze its testing, US and South Korea would freeze their military exercises. And that served China's interest, because China doesn't want the US and South Korea to be conducting these joint exercises. But Kim, didn't follow China's, view. And the last part is that, President Xi and President Kim never met, right, until after President Trump and President Kim agreed to meet. So in 5 years, President Xi Jinping and President Kim Jong-un, they never met. So it was only right after the announcement came that you saw President Xi scramble, really, to have a meeting with President Kim. So I think they certainly played an important role, but in that last sort of decision, on the terms or on where it was going to be held, the summit, I don't think that China was a major player.
Interesting. Okay, let's go to the second half here in the back.
Thank you for your presentation. Any comments on our withdrawal from TPP, and are the Chinese people aware of the impacts that might have?
So certainly the Chinese scholarly community, analytic community, think tank, government, they're extremely aware of it. Before we withdrew, there was a growing group within China that really wanted to begin the process of accession for China itself. So economic reformers in China saw the potential of the Trans-Pacific Partnership to act as a kind of external pressure to bring about more economic reform. So they had moved from condemning TPP publicly to having a pretty sizable group that was reasonably enthusiastic about China's own accession to it. Basically now, the Chinese view the US withdrawal as a win for them. right? Because the TPP was, part of the pivot or rebalance that, was at the heart of President Obama's policy to ensure continued U.S. leadership in the region, that, sort of U.S. rules of the game, whether on free trade or freedom of navigation or human rights, that the U.S. was basically developing, institutional infrastructure to ensure that that would continue into the future. And the TPP was the centerpiece obviously on the trade side. So our withdrawal from it means, we have no leadership role at this point in time on the economic front. So from the Chinese perspective, no harm, it's, a win.
Okay, let's go to the gentleman in the second row from the back on your left. No, sorry, the mic is already.
Hi. You mentioned bilateral communications that our president has with Xi, and your recommendation not to do that, which I agree with. In rank order, who would be the top 2 or 3 countries that should be part of our foreign policy dialogue with China?
In rank order, okay, I mean, certainly within Asia, it would be Japan, South Korea, India, Australia. And I think, one of the interesting innovations that's emerged from the Trump administration is this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific and the Quad, which was really a Japanese proposal back in 2007 that didn't go anywhere because the Australians withdrew, but it was basically to have Australia, Japan, India, and the United States form a kind of quadrilateral alliance that would be not only for security purposes, but also economic and broad political values as well. So that's come back into some formation. It doesn't yet have any content. They met for the first time back last November. So we'll have to wait to see whether it's given any real life. But that is one potential sort of grouping that could make a difference. I'll just note that the Japanese and the Indians, for example, have been quite active in pursuing a kind of counter Belt and Road in Africa. They have their own Japanese and Indian African Economic Growth Corridor, which is also developed for infrastructure and other things like that. Australia also pushed back against Chinese fiber optic cables from the Solomon Islands that would connect into Australia. So other countries in the region are actually stepping up to the plate in some significant ways. But the U.S. has been largely agnostic or absent, but that Quad is maybe one way we could become more engaged again.
Okay, and we have one question right there.
If you were an ambitious young party official, what sort of missteps could get you prosecuted? And how spurious or substantive could the grounds be, legally speaking?
Or an ambitious party official. It's a tricky, I'll tell you, the landscape is quite challenging right now because you can be neither too aggressive you could be too aggressive and you could be not aggressive enough. So for example, there's been, Li Keqiang, the premier, has stepped out and said, we need to have more projects going through. There's a period where no new economic development was taking place, or not no, but economic development had slowed down significantly. Joint ventures were slowing down because officials were afraid. Nobody wanted to stick their neck out and potentially have it be lopped off. So he went out and said, you have to be doing more. So I think it's tricky right now for Chinese officials to understand exactly what they should be doing. You can see the same kind of thing on the environmental front, right? So if you really clamp down on the steel and the coal, you can watch your growth rate drop. Well, they're evaluating you on both growing the economy and protecting the environment. How do you strike that balance correctly? So there's a lot of sort of guidance from the top, but not necessarily very specific guidelines for how local officials should get things done. And so I think that puts them in a very significant gray area that makes it quite difficult. And there are lots of other ways they could get in trouble. You could, be religious, right? You could, make a joke on the internet. There are many ways, but if you're really ambitious, you're not going to be doing those things to begin with.
Okay, and we're going to go to this side, to the lady in black.
Thank you very much for your comments. Could you talk a little bit about the lack of transparency and if there is a movement of civil unrest that perhaps we just not see publicized?
Sure. So I think, again, one of the ways that we really began to understand the degree of sort of the social dynamics in China was through the internet, leading up to Xi Jinping's ascension to power in 2012. It wasn't simply that there was a protest, but that protest would be recorded on the internet. You could see videos of the protests, and then you could track protests, environmental protests in one city that might move to another city. And people were learning from, a protest here and a protest there. So that kind of information was much more readily available. Now it's much more difficult for the outside world to know exactly what's going on. Things are censored very quickly. I mean, we still hear, most recently there was an incident where two feminists were beaten by some security personnel, and that went viral. Now it'll get shut down very quickly, but it's out there now, and everybody knows about it. So I think we can still learn, we can still see that these things are happening, but it's much more difficult to get an overall sense, throughout the country what's going on, because the Chinese media certainly isn't reporting on it, and the internet is just so much more constrained than it used to be.
Okay, we'll take one final question from the online audience, and this got the most votes, so I kind of have to ask it. You highlight that China is likely preparing to begin exporting its political system. Which nations do you believe are first?
I think we can already see nations that are, being trained by China. As I suggested, countries in Africa like Sudan and South Sudan, and Namibia and Laos and Cambodia. I think any place where there are certainly authoritarian tendencies are likely candidates. I think China, to some extent, it's like, it's the opposite of Woodrow Wilson is, making the world safe for autocracy as opposed to making the world safe for democracy.
Okay, that's all the time we have. Please join me in thanking our speaker. And as a reminder, you can purchase her new